You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Up next, a conversation about untold stories of Islamophobia in Canada. But first, some news headlines. Weekend protests for Ukraine draw massive crowds across Canada. Ottawa-based Muslim charity denied suspension freeze. Vandalism attacks slow police response, isolates cab drivers in Yellowknife. Irish lawmaker calls out double standards on Ukraine, Palestine. And now the details. Protests in support of Ukraine were carried out for the second weekend in a row as thousands rallied outside consulates and legislatures across Canada. Protesters, many holding yellow and blue flags, chanted "No-Fly Zone," a call for NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. NATO has not agreed to no-fly zones, saying they do not want to escalate tensions. The demonstrations come as the Russian war on Ukraine enters its 12th day, with both countries in negotiations to establish humanitarian corridors. A panel of 3 judges rejected an Ottawa-based Muslim charity's request to put on hold a CRA suspension of its tax receipting privileges while an appeal is heard. Human Concern International, or HCI, maintained the objection should be heard before any suspension is carried out, which the Court of Appeal says holds no merit. HCI criticised the decision, as reported by local media sources, saying the CRA has become the prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner. The CRA has targeted unfairly Muslim charities in the last few years, according to research published by the University of Toronto and National Council of Canadian Muslims. Taxi drivers grow frustrated in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, as they note the police's slow response to 16 attacks of vandalism in the span of 4 days. Vice President of City Cab, Kareem Yellowknife, told local media sources that his drivers feel like second-class citizens when their reports to the police are met with silence. With attacks increasing within the last few weeks, repairs costing hundreds or thousands of dollars leaves drivers feeling lonely and helpless, especially when this is their only source of income. Yellowknife wants the police to be more active in protecting drivers' rights, even if it takes a taxi protest to do so. Irish lawmaker Richard Boyd Barrett called out the Irish government for their double standards on the Ukraine war. He said that Russia was sanctioned for its actions in Ukraine, but Israel's actions in Palestine were not. He listed Israeli infringements of Palestinian rights, including assaults on Gaza and the annexation of land. Barrett said it took the government 5 days to put sanctions on Russia, while Palestinians who have been oppressed for over 70 years were sidelined. His speech comes amidst concerns over racist media coverage and international responses to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that's it for the news. From time to time, I've heard conservative politicians say things like there's no racism in Canada. Quite infamously, in 2019, the Premier of Quebec, Legault, said 2 days after the anniversary of the Quebec mosque shooting, there's no problem of Islamophobia in Quebec. So I've always thought it was time to produce some stories of what's happening on the ground with Islamophobia. And we have Islamic Relief new report called In Their Words, Untold Stories of Islamophobia in Canada. Reyhana Patel is here to talk to us about it today. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Now, you heard my little introduction there. I actually was planning a book capturing the stories of Islamophobia in Canada. Now I don't have to because Islamic Relief has done that, compiled some voices. Can you tell us why you wanted to do this report?
Yeah, so Islamic Relief Canada, we've been supporting the families of the Quebec mosque shooting victims, the 6 men that were killed about 5 years ago. And when we were talking as a team on what we wanted to do on January 29th, that just passed, which is the National Day for Remembrance on Islamophobia, we were thinking, like, what do we want to say to Canadians out there, both Muslims and non-Muslims? And after my visit with the widows of the 6 men that were killed in the Quebec mosque shooting, I always like came out with this inspiration, despite having gone through like so much tragedy, I just felt so inspired that these women were so resilient. And I really wanted to tell that story to Canadians. Like, this is the effect that Islamophobia is having. Like, look at what these women and children are going through. And then when we talked about it as a team, we thought, yeah, we want to do something. We want to do a report. We want to tell stories. So let's tell the stories of Canadian Muslims across the country who experienced or are experiencing Islamophobia on a daily basis. And we're talking Islamophobia in all forms, every day to physical violence, to verbal abuse, all forms of Islamophobia. And that's how we embarked on this.
And is that how the project of research and telling stories of Islamophobia in Canada fits into the mandate of Islamic Relief, which I thought was a humanitarian relief organization?
Yes, we are a humanitarian organization, but our mission is to alleviate poverty and suffering. And when we talk about suffering, we talk about, it's Islamophobia. We have communities around the world, not just in Canada, that are experiencing Islamophobia. And so that's how we saw it, tackling Islamophobia.
When you had that meeting and you decided you wanted to get together to do the capture the stories, and then you reached out across coast to coast, how was the research conducted?
Yeah, so we did a call out for people who were interested in telling their stories, and we had a good response. We actually didn't really do a public call out. We did some stuff on our social media, but we went through our networks as well. And obviously we couldn't tell everyone's stories. We wanted to only do about 10. So we got quite a bit. I think we got about maybe 15, over 20 people who wanted to tell their stories, and our researcher vetted them. And we wanted to make sure we had a diverse set of voices across, all regions across the country, but also kind of different experiences.
And did you, so did they write their own narratives, like autobiography, and they were edited, or you had a researcher interview them?
No, we did interviews. So we did one-to-one interviews. So our researcher, our primary researcher, Miranda, she did one-to-one interviews with everyone. And then that was edited down into a story format.
Right. Then usually when we do those kinds of interviews, we promise confidentiality to the recipient, to the participants, so that they can feel free to tell the whole story. But in your report, they're named. I think there are even photographs.
There were some of them. I think there were 2 people who actually asked for their names and their photographs to be used. They were very, very vocal about that. But the majority of the other respondents wanted to remain anonymous. And that was actually given at the beginning. We said, we want to tell your story. We understand that this is difficult. There's a lot of reasons why people don't want to make their story public, even reveal their names or their pictures. So we made that very clear in the beginning. But yeah, there were about two women actually and one man who wanted their real name be featured in the report.
I'm actually in the middle of doing some research about the coping experiences of Islamophobia in the medical field. And one of the things that struck me about your report was a finding that more women had come forward than men, and I'm finding the same. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think generally across when you research Islamophobia, we know that women are disproportionately affected by Islamophobia because a lot of it is because of their visibility, or because of how they've told their story throughout their life. And so when we did the call out, the majority of the people that came back were women, and that's no surprise. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to you. We know that across the board. That Islamophobia disproportionately affects Muslim women.
And what other major findings were there of the report?
Yeah, so apart from the Islamophobia being gendered, we felt Islamophobia was normalized to the sense that people, the victims that we spoke to, they actually thought that their experience wasn't big enough to report it or call it big name Islamophobia. And a lot of the questions that we asked, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you say something? And a lot of participants were like, well, it's not a big deal. Other things happen to people. This is just a small detail. And to them that was, but in the context of things, like some of the stories that we heard, and I can go into that a little bit more, but it is, it is pretty big. It's Islamophobia. And that's actually a pretty big finding. And we have to make sure that, over the next few years in the future, that this form of racism is not normalized within Canadian society.
We interviewed on the show someone who's working with high school students to empower them to deal with Islamophobia. And they found the exact same thing, that these things were happening and the students thought this was sort of like, I mean, it's not pleasant, but it's normal. So why don't you give us an example?
Yeah, so I'll give you a few. So I think the two stories that really stood out for me, and we're talking about high school. So we interviewed a Muslim lady who told us that in high school she had a bunch of boys ripped off her hijab and then just ran away thinking it was funny. And that's a big deal, but for her, she was like, okay, they just didn't understand. And she went and spoke to them and explained the gravity of the situation. But just the thought of someone being able to do that without realizing that's a big deal. Another story that really stood out for me was another Muslim teacher in Quebec who was severely affected by Bill 21, and which discriminates against the wearing of religious symbols in public in public settings. And because she was a teacher, she was told that she couldn't continue to be a teacher if she continued to wear her hijab. And she fought this with everything that she had. And in the end, she did find a loophole in her contract that allowed her to keep working. But the experience was so traumatic for her that she's actually now considering moving out of Canada altogether. So that's pretty big. And another story that was there was a Muslim woman who married a revert, a Muslim man who converted to Islam, and her in-laws just gave her so much stress about being a Muslim, to the extent that every time they went over for dinner, like they would serve pork and other items that were non-halal, and basically her kids were forced to either eat it or not eat at all. So those were just some of the stories. And then there were some workplace incidences as well, where people were afraid to go to their HR department, or, like casual conversations within the workplace, employees asking Muslim women about why they're wearing the hijab or why they have to pray, and to a
so
lot
what do you hope the report, you've collected these narratives, people, I assume it's going to be put online. I think that's where I read it. What do you hope to come out of this?
Well, I really, really want people to read it and understand that when we talk about Islamophobia, a lot of the time we think politically. A lot of people think there's a political element to it. And yes, of course, like there is that political discourse, and we can't come back to Islamophobia without adequate legislation. But at the end of the day, we wanted to take that political discourse out and actually hear the stories. And my hope is that when people read the stories, they realize that, this is actually a very serious issue. Yes, it is political, but action needs to be taken to make sure that, these incidents don't happen again, or that is not normalized within society to that extent.
Well, I guess the first action is empathy, but unfortunately we're out of time. But thank you for joining us today and sharing us a little bit about this report.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay tuned for the next episode. Share, like, and subscribe. Stay safe. God bless.